This is the satin stitch, or more precisely the padded satin stitch. The first thing that I'm doing, I'm working on the turned tip of a leaf here. And before I actually begin the satin stitching, I'm going to work a very simple outline using a back stitch all around the area that I'm going to satin stitch. And I'm actually going to satin stitch over this outline. Opinions vary on whether or not you have to outline everything that you satin stitch. Certainly you don't, but I do it to provide a precise edge. I just think it looks better. I'm also going to pad this after I stitch the outline. I'm going to fill in the area with long straight stitches that run perpendicular to my satin stitching. I'm working with cotton abroader right now, which is a non-divisible mercerized cotton. It's a soft embroidery thread that has a very nice sheen to it. Outside of silk, I like it best for satin stitching. Now, if you're using stranded cotton to satin stitch, the outline and the padding can be worked in 1 or 2 threads, but I always suggest that the finishing, the satin stitching itself, which will be done, that'll be the last layer, that's done with only 1 thread. Why? Because when you satin stitch, or actually when you embroider with more than 1 thread, what generally happens is your threads tend to twist together. Even if you separate your divisible floss first and put it back together, as you work, it will twist together naturally. To avoid that, you can hold your work up and let your needle drop so that your threads untwist a little bit. But even then, in the satin stitch, what you're striving for is the smoothest possible finish on the top. And really, you can only achieve that with 1 thread. You can use a laying tool, and that does help. The laying tool will help you keep those threads, when you're using 2 threads, that'll help keep them untwisted. But using a laying tool also takes time. And I just find it, I just get better results overall if I'm using just 1 strand for my final stitching on the top. So here I'm actually working the satin stitch. Notice that I'm working outside the outline. I'm not working inside the outline. So my stitches are going from the outside on one side of the design to the outside on the other side of the design. You want your stitches to fall, well, you want them to be perfectly parallel to each other, right next to each other without buckling up on top of each other. And at the same time, you don't want them far enough apart where you can see what's underneath the stitching. You want to keep them as close together as possible without buckling over the top of each other. And far enough apart, though, so that they don't do that, but not too far to see anything underneath them. And I'm coming to the end of this little point. I'm going to take the stitches as small as I can to create a bit of a point at the end of this little design. You'll notice with the padding that the satin stitch stands up in relief. You can certainly stitch without padding if you want your satin stitching to be a lot flatter. You can also use a different thread for your outline if you want to use a finer thread to help reduce the relief of the satin stitch. Also, you'll notice that I started in the middle of the design and worked to one side. Now I'm going back to the middle and I'm going to work to the left side. And again, doing the same thing, laying the stitches down so that they are close enough together. You can't see fabric or you can't see the padding behind the stitches, but not too close that they lay on top of each other or buckle. You want them to lay very smoothly. You can use your fabric as a gauge. Look closely at the weave of your fabric. You can probably manage your stitches by always stitching over at least one thread in your fabric, sometimes two depending on the type of fabric you're using. Here I'm using lawn with this cotton abroader. Now I'm going to work towards the tip of this. And again, I'm going to bring it down to the stitches being as small as possible to create a little point at the end of that. And if I wanted to add a little bit of texture or a contrast in this leaf, I might stitch the underside of the leaf, the rest of the leaf here, in seed stitch or in long and short stitch, filling it in. Or I might use stem stitch as a filler. And so the satin stitch would look very smooth and it would stand out above the flatter stitches that fill in the rest of the shape. Another important thing when you're satin stitching, you don't want to satin stitch large shapes. Most satin stitching is done over small areas. In fact, good satin stitching is usually done over small areas. If the area you're stitching is too large, your threads will be loose and they won't lay nicely. Also, the padding adds a little bit of friction underneath those threads, so it does help keep them from separating. But at the same time, even if the shape is very large and you're satin stitching, well, it doesn't necessarily look good. Rarely does it look good to satin stitch a very large area. My students have tried to do it before, and they say, well, what's wrong with this? Well, the area is too big for satin stitching. You have to fill it some other way. So here we are at the tip, and you'll want to take that down. I think that's probably the last stitch here. And there's the finish. With just a little bit of practice, if you spend some time with it, you'll find that satin stitching is not so hard, and you'll get beautiful results.